So imagine this scenario. You're having a relaxing afternoon with your kids in your own backyard, enjoying the warm sun and the cool breeze from the pool. Your 10-year-old sons are laughing and playing together, completely carefree. But then, out of nowhere, a frantic, angry woman appears at your fence, yelling and screaming at your children to get out of the pool. That's exactly what happened to me when racist ginger Karen trespassed onto my property and started harassing my kids. I was shocked, furious, and more than a little concerned for my son's safety. But that was just the beginning. Karen's behavior escalated quickly, and before I knew it, she was calling 911 and accusing my children of disturbing the neighborhood. The police showed up, and in a shocking twist, Karen ended up being taken away in an ambulance and placed in a psychiatric ward. I'm still trying to process what happened that day, but I'm determined to share my story with you in the hopes that it will raise awareness about racism and the importance of standing up for yourself and your loved ones. So, let's start from the beginning. I was enjoying a quiet afternoon with my sons in our backyard when Karen suddenly appeared at our fence. She was clearly agitated and looked like she was ready to explode. "What are you doing?" I asked her calmly, trying to defuse the situation. "We're disturbing the neighborhood," she shouted back at me, her eyes blazing with anger. "You need to get your kids out of the pool." I was taken aback by her behavior. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my cool. "We're not disturbing anyone. We're just enjoying our own backyard." But Karen wasn't having it. She started screaming at me and my sons, telling us that we were being too loud and that we needed to leave. I tried to reason with her, but she was beyond reason. "Ma'am, I understand that you may be concerned about noise levels," I said, "but my children are not disturbing anyone. They're just playing in their own pool." But Karen wouldn't listen. She kept yelling and screaming at us, getting more and more agitated by the minute. Finally, she pulled out her phone and started dialing 911. I was shocked. "What are you doing?" I asked her. "I'm calling the police," she shouted back at me. "They need to come and make you get your kids out of the pool." I was furious. How could she be so racist and so entitled? But I tried to stay calm and let the police handle the situation. When the officers arrived, they were taken aback by Karen's behavior. They tried to reason with her, but she was beyond reason. "I'm calling for backup," one of the officers shouted into his radio. "We have a woman who's threatening to harm a family in their own backyard." The situation escalated quickly, with Karen becoming more and more agitated. She started yelling at the officers and telling them that they were being too soft on us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers had had enough. They arrested Karen on the spot and took her away in handcuffs. But that wasn't the end of it. As we were watching Karen being taken away, she started screaming and shouting at us again, telling us that we were going to pay for what we had done. It was then that I realized that Karen was not just racist, she was also unstable. She was clearly unhinged and in need of help. The police took her away to a psychiatric ward, where she was evaluated and diagnosed with a serious mental health condition. As I watched her being taken away, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, sadness, and frustration. Relief that the situation had been resolved without anyone getting hurt. Anger at Karen's racism and entitlement. Sadness that our neighborhood had been disrupted by her behavior. And frustration that she had been allowed to behave in such a way for so long without consequences. But most of all, I felt a sense of pride in my sons. They had stood up for themselves and for their right to enjoy their own backyard without fear of harassment or intimidation. As we watched Karen being taken away, my sons turned to me and said, "Daddy, we're proud of you for standing up to her." I smiled and hugged them tightly. "I'm proud of us too," I said. "We stood up for ourselves and for what's right." And as we went back inside our house, I knew that we would never forget this experience. We would never forget the day that racist ginger Karen trespassed onto our property and tried to intimidate us. But most of all, we would never forget the day that we stood up for ourselves and fought back against racism and entitlement. So, if you're ever faced with a situation like this, remember to stand up for yourself and your loved ones. Don't let people like Karen bully or intimidate you. And always remember that you have the power to create change in your community. Don't be afraid to speak out against racism and entitlement. We are stronger together, and we will always stand up for what's right. As I continued to process what had happened that day, I couldn't help but wonder how Karen had become so consumed by hatred and intolerance. Had she always been this way? Or had something triggered her behavior? I knew that I would never know the answer to those questions. But what I did know was that Karen's behavior had been unacceptable. She had trespassed onto our property, harassed our children, and called 911 with a false accusation. And in the end, she had ended up in a psychiatric ward. I couldn't help but think that maybe this was a wake-up call for Karen. Maybe this was an opportunity for her to seek help and change her ways. But as I looked around at our neighborhood, I knew that there were still many people like Karen who needed to be confronted about their racism and entitlement. And so, I made a promise to myself that day. I would continue to stand up for myself and my loved ones. I would continue to fight against racism and entitlement. And I would continue to create change in my community. Because when we stand up for what's right, we create a better world for everyone. As I finished writing this story, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in myself and my family. We had stood up for ourselves against racism and entitlement. We had fought back against hate, and we had emerged victorious. And as I looked at my sons, I knew that they would always remember this experience. They would remember the day that they stood up for themselves against racism. They would remember the day that they fought back against hate. And they would remember the day that they emerged victorious. Because when we stand up for what's right, we create a better world for everyone. And so, let's all make a promise to ourselves today. Let's promise to stand up for ourselves against racism. Let's promise to fight back against hate. And let's promise to create change in our communities. Because when we do, we will create a better world for everyone. And as we move forward into a brighter future, let's never forget the lessons we've learned from this experience. Let's never forget the power of standing up for ourselves. Let's never forget the importance of fighting back against hate. And let's never forget the impact we can have when we create change in our communities. Because when we stand up for what's right, we create a better world for everyone. After Karen's incident with me and my family, there were many changes made in our community. The HOA board was replaced with new members who were more inclusive and welcoming. Racism training was implemented for all community members, and a new program was created to support families who had experienced trauma due to racist incidents like mine. It was a long road to recovery, but with the help of our community coming together to support each other, we were able to heal and move forward. And as I look around at our community today, I see a sense of peace and unity that I never thought possible. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope for change and growth. And so, let's continue to stand up for what's right. Let's continue to fight back against hate. And let's continue to create change in our communities. Because when we do, we will create a better world for everyone.